the Bible, they say, well, that's really silly. Obviously, Noah's Ark and the story of Noah, it's just a story. It's fiction, because they see something that looks like that. But when you actually read the Bible and see how big it was, that's what it really looked like. It was enormous. That's just so you can kind of see how big it is. And we know how many animals we could fit onto a truck that size, and we know how many trucks that size we could fit into the ark. You see, that ark was 450 feet. It had 3 decks. It's over 1 million cubic feet. It's like way, 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 way bigger, 10 times or more bigger than this room. It's like 560 trucks that big, and you can put about 1,000 animals in each one of these trucks, so it would hold 100,000 animals. That's more than enough for every single kind of bird, every single kind of mammal, every single kind of frog and reptile and amphibian. Everything that lived on land that breathed air could have fit in only about 30% of the space in the ark. What do you think God did with the rest of the space? What do you think Noah did? If all the animals would fit in only 1/3 of that boat, why did it need to be so big? What do you think? Exactly. They had to feed those animals. He had no idea how long the flood was going to last. God didn't tell him, but he had to take a lot of food. And that's why it was so big. See, it all makes sense. Now, if the flood was just some little local flood that kind of flooded one little valley over around Israel, would he have needed to build a boat that big? No. Only needed a boat that big if it was a flood that flooded the entire world. See, every part of what the Bible tells us only makes sense if you believe all of it. And it really was an event that really did happen. Now, people, they think wrong because they're trained to think wrong. You are blessed. You know, your parents spend a lot of money to send you to school, at a Christian school where you get to hear about God and you get to hear about what the Bible says. So you will think right, and you're training your brains to think right. Now, I'm going to show a little film in a little while of how hard it is to think in a different way once we've been trained to think in only the wrong way, or even in a different way. Let me show you how the world is trained to think with this little illustration. What are those? Lizards. They're not dinosaurs, they're lizards, okay? But they're different sizes, aren't they? I mean, you got a little lizard here, you got a big lizard there, you got a brown lizard there, you got a tan lizard here. Well, you can get lots of different lizards from the same parents. Just like when your parents had children. Any of you have brothers and sisters? Raise your hand if you do. Do they look exactly like you do? Are they exactly the same height as you are? No, they're all different because God likes creativity and variety. Same thing are true with animals. You could have a pair of lizards that before they become a very specific little breed. I'm going to show you that in a second with these skulls a little later. They'll have all sorts of variety. You can have little ones and big ones. You can have dark ones. You can have light ones. And then if they marry together, you can end up with only a certain kind of lizard, but you started out with lots of variety. So when God made the lizard kind, it didn't mean he had to make all the different kinds we see today, because they had lots of different brothers and sisters in variety. But do lizards slowly turn, their scales turn into feathers and their legs turn into wings and they slowly turn into a bird? No, see, that doesn't happen. We do see this happen, and people call that evolution because we do see it happen, but then they pretend that this happens. One of them is thinking in the correct way, training your brain to see what's actually happening. The other is pretending, and you're seeing things in the wrong way. And that's what we're trying to help you not to do, to always ride your bike in the right way. You'll see a little movie in a little bit that shows that. Actually, we're going to do it right now. Watch this little film about a man. By the way, how many of you know how to ride a bike? Raise your hand. You don't know how to ride a bike? Okay, raise your hand. Got to make sure you're awake. Well, this is a man who grew up riding his bike, And all of a sudden, he did something. You can lower your hand. So he no longer could ride a bicycle. Do you think you'd someday, after 10 years, you'd quit, you would forget how to ride a bicycle? Well, I'm going to show you a bicycle that none of you could ride. It's impossible for you to ride this bicycle because your brain has been trained to only do it in one way. Now let me find this film. It's called Riding a Backwards Bicycle. Watch what happens when somebody turns the bicycle and makes it work backwards. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, we'll need the sound. No sound?
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? Everything changed, though, when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
He knows just what to do. He's just has to turn the other way.
So the faster I go, the better. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand. So, this way. Okay, all right, a second. All right, so, whenever you're ready. Yeah. Go ahead. No, you have to keep your feet on. Just keep your feet on the pedals. Hands on. Yeah, come on.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut.
Are you gonna give up?
No.
Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult.
It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child. I felt like the only person on the planet who had ever unlearned how to ride a bike, and I couldn't articulate it to anyone because everybody just knew that you can't forget how to ride a bike. So I learned 3 things from this experiment. I learned that welders are often smarter than engineers. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding. And I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not. I'm Destin. You're getting smarter every day. Have a good one.
Now, wasn't that kind of cool? You know, some of the things he said, once you train your brain to think in a certain way, it is really, really, really hard to get it to think in another way. The reason your parents are spending thousands of dollars so you can come to a Christian school is so you will not leave God out of your thinking. People who leave God out of their thinking, they're trained to think a lizard could turn into a bird, a dinosaur could turn into a bird. It's not true. There's no evidence for it, but that's how they're trained to ride their bike. Even though they see the evidence that God made things, they can't understand it. They can't accept it. There's a verse in the Bible that says, lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him. Acknowledge God, acknowledge His Word. Then we'll think correctly. You know, that man, it took him 8 months. Every day he'd try to ride the bicycle and he'd fall down. He'd try to ride the bicycle and he'd fall down. He'd try to ride the bicycle because his brain kept wanting to turn and lean the wrong way. He finally retrained his brain to do it the different way. By the end, he could ride that backwards bike just like it was a normal bike. And that's the only kind of bike he would ride. Then he went to try to ride a normal bike again. Guess what happened? He couldn't ride it. He would fall down every time he tried to ride a normal bicycle. People thought he was crazy. This man can't even ride a bicycle. It's because he'd trained his brain to think in a different way. Because we can't believe what's the truth and believe a lie at the same time. We're going to believe one or the other. And then we're going to live and act as if it's the truth. That's why these things are so important. Okay, now, let's look at another example of how we can know the truth and the impact it has. We can learn so much from creation. God made things so we would learn from them and so we would know He's the one that made them. And He told us this. This is the very first thing God told us. He made Adam and Eve. He blessed them. He said, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish. Now that's a 500-year-old word that really means to fill the earth. And then He said, subdue it and have dominion. That means to control it and understand it. We are to understand creation and the fish and the birds and everything that lives on the earth. Now, let me show you something we learned because we realized God made it. And God told us to look at the beasts He has made and they will teach us things. It took people from when God made Adam and Eve almost 6,000 years to learn to fly. Don't you think Adam and Eve and the people at the time of Michelangelo and King David and Abraham, they looked up at the birds and they all thought, wow, it would be really cool to fly. Have any of you ever put your arms out and kind of run around and went, eow, and wished you could fly? Has anybody ever done that? Come on. Yeah, I did. You know it's true. We've all wanted to fly. And for thousands of years, we've tried. I want to show you a little movie. I went on the internet and I found these and I put them all together of people trying to fly before we had airplanes. Now, we learned to make movies. We learned to take pictures clear back in the 1840s. We learned to take movies about the 1880s, but we didn't learn to fly until 1903. So these movies were taken before we had invented the airplane. Watch the movies of people trying to learn how to fly. Okay, where it is. Let me back up. Where did it go? Just a second. Okay, I'm missing it. I'm going to have to go looking for my little movie of man learning how to fly. Hang on just a second. Early flight. Here it is. Now, hang on just a second. I'm going to get back to my presentation. Now, what did all those have in common? What were they all imitating? Just say it. Birds, right? And wings. They were trying to do what God had done. And they all failed. It didn't work for any of them. Do you know why? Because they hadn't figured out how creation worked. It took a long time until we understood the design of the bird's wings. You see, that wing is shaped in just a certain way, so when air flows past it, it has to flow faster across the top and slower at the bottom. So there's low pressure at the top, high pressure at the bottom, and the wing is pushed upward. But you got to get it moving really fast for that to happen. The Wright brothers I should have asked you if you knew who invented the airplane. Too late. Okay, do you remember what their names were? Who invented the airplane? Go ahead, anybody. Just shout it out. Orville and Wilbur. I heard you say it. You even know their first names. Orville and Wilbur Wright. Did you know that they were strong Christians? They believed in God, and they believed God had made everything, so we should be able to learn from what God had made. And based on that firm belief, they studied the design of a wing, and they created a wing that looked just like a bird's wing, and they realized, I've got to get it moving fast enough so it will lift this really heavy airplane carrying people off the ground. And so they did it. It was in December of 1903, and they didn't even know if they would succeed, and they were amazed. Only Orville got on the plane for that first flight, and it flew about 200 feet, about 20 feet off the ground, and then it landed. Then they ran and they got reporters, and they got someone to film it, and they came back, and both Orville and Wilbur climbed onto the plane, and they filmed themselves for the first time. Now think about this. For the first time in 6,000 years of trying, mankind learned to fly. Watch this movie of the original flight of the Wright brothers. Now they had to lift up this big weight in order for it to fall down and make the plane go fast enough to get up in the air. There goes Wilbur and Orville climbing onto the plane. There goes that weight dropping down, shoving the plane forward. Up it goes. There's the reporters. They're amazed. They can't believe what they're seeing. Mankind is flying for the first time ever. There they go. And they're turning and banging, soaring up and down. Here they come in for a landing. Isn't that cool? The very first time people ever flew. And we got it on movies. And they did it because God did it first. If God hadn't created birds, we would have never flown. We had to learn from what God made and learn why it worked. But that's not the only thing we learned. You see, we continue to learn from birds. There's a certain kind of a bird that's like no other bird. I showed you a few of those yesterday, one that could fly 6,000 to 7,000 miles. This is a bird called a swift. It's the swift bird. What do you think it's really good at? Just say it. Swift. Swift means fast. He is the fastest bird that can fly in a straight line. There's birds like eagles and hawks that can go over 200 miles an hour diving down. But flying just in a straight line, this guy can fly at 140 kilometers. That's 105 miles per hour. I mean, think about you in your car and your dad's driving along and he's not paying attention, and all of a sudden he's driving at like 80 miles an hour on the expressway, and a policeman comes to give him a ticket. Well, this bird would go zooming by him like he's almost standing still at 105 miles an hour on a level flight. Not only that, this bird flies almost continuously. He loves to fly. He never stops flying. Matter of fact, he flies the equivalent of 2.5 million miles. That's like all the way to the moon and back to Earth 8 times in his lifetime. It's 100 times all the way around the Earth. He doesn't even stop to take a drink. When he gets thirsty, he just swoops down, opens his mouth, scoops up some water, and keeps flying without ever stopping. That's how he drinks, because he doesn't like to stop. He loves flying so much. He sleeps while he's flying. Yeah! This bird, he shuts one of his eyes, and he shuts off half of his brain, and he keeps flying. Then he opens that eye, shuts down his other eye, shuts off the other half of his brain, and it goes to sleep, and he keeps flying. So he never has to stop. That's how much he loves to fly. Not only that, he makes babies while flying. He gets together with another female and the male bird, and they make babies in the air. They don't even land, because he loves flying so much. He loves to fly. Now, when we looked at the Wright brothers airplane, it had wings that were sticking straight out, didn't it? When we looked at World War II planes, their wings are sticking straight out. When we look at World War I, when we look at World War II planes, their wings were sticking straight out. All the early airliners in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, their wings are sticking straight out. What do airplanes look like today? Their wings are swept back. Look at the wings on this bird. As we made airplanes that would fly faster and faster, we realized to make them more maneuverable, to make them fly better, we better look at a bird that knows how to fly really fast and loves to fly. And its wings are swept backwards. They're not straight out. So we started making our airplanes the same way as the birds. And the designers say they looked at the birds to figure out how to make other kinds of airplanes. There's other things we learned. You see, when airplanes are flying faster and faster and faster, they still have to land, don't they? And if they're flying at 400 miles an hour and they have to land, they'd have to have a runway 10 miles long in order to slow down and stop. So they slow down before they land, but they're really heavy. And when they slow down, they start to lose what's called lift. Remember I said that the wing has to move really fast in order to lift up all that weight. And if it slows down, it'll just start to flutter like a leaf. When you drop a leaf, it doesn't glide. You know, it doesn't act like these airplanes. See how those airplanes fly? It just flutters to the ground, kind of like this. And it crashes, and a lot of people died because when the airplane slowed down, it wouldn't land properly. So they looked at the birds and thought, how do birds do that? How do these great big eagles, these huge, big, heavy birds, some of these birds have wingspans more than this, more than 6 feet wide, huge birds. They noticed these birds have little feathers on the front of their wings. Instead of all the feathers being on the back, they have these little feathers on the front. And when they're coming in for a landing, they stick these feathers out on the front of the wings. They're called leading edge flaps. And we started to make all of our airplanes with these same little flaps in the front. And it allows the airplane to slow down without losing lift, and it can land safely. Because God did it first. Because God invented it, we looked at what He'd made, we learned how to fly better. But it's not even just flying. You see, I was in the woods one day, and I was walking in the path late at night, and all of a sudden something came over my head, and it was huge. And I felt like, whoa, it almost ran into me. But I didn't hear a sound. I didn't hear any air. I didn't hear any flapping. I heard nothing. It's just all of a sudden there was this huge thing flying past my head. It was an owl, a barn owl. And these animals, they have wings that are this big. They're huge birds. And they only fly at night. They have great big eyes. By the way, what's an owl say? Who am I? How does it fly so quiet? This bird, the owl, it's like a stealth fighter of the bird world because it's so quiet. Somehow it can move through the air and not make hardly any sound. And then it can like zoom down and grab a mouse and have its food, and the mouse never hears it coming. Well, when I grew up, there weren't any computers. You know, when I went to high school, they didn't even have calculators. We were still using slide rules in junior high school. They had just invented calculators. A little calculator that did nothing but like multiply and divide and add and subtract numbers. That's all it would do. Cost $100 to buy one. And that's all it would do. Well, then they invented computers, but computers used lots of energy. And they had to keep them cool or they would burn up, so they would put fans in them. But these fans are really loud. They'd go, and they'd be really loud and really annoying to have a computer that loud. So the people making computers, they started thinking, how can we move air to cool our computer without making all of this annoying noise? Where do you think they started looking? At the owl. How can the owl fly through the air without making all that annoying noise? And they designed the fans that they put in the computers with the same sort of pitch and the angle and the shape as the wings and the feathers were on the owl. And the fans got much quieter. So they designed computer fans based on what God had done first. We can learn so much by looking at what God has already made. So remember that as you go out in life. Now I'm going to do one last thing. This is how people ride their bicycles the wrong way. They look at things they find in the ground like fossils and skulls, and we'll find skulls that look like this. It's a monkey, okay? It's got a big ridge. It's got a wee little teeny brain, and then they'll find skulls with a little bigger brain, and then they'll find pieces of skulls and try to pretend they can reproduce them. And here's a human skull with a great big brain and a real high forehead, and they'll line them up and they'll say, see, this proves a monkey turned into a human being. Well, they cheat, first of all, because this skull is much smaller, but they're making it look bigger to try to pretend it's on its way to being a human. And when they find pieces, they put them together wrong. But people see this, and they're trained to think. Evolution's true. Monkeys have turned into people. So look at the difference between all these skulls. They kind of look a little bit similar, don't they? Well, let me give you another set of skulls. Okay, let's pretend I'm a scientist, and I'm digging in the dirt, and I find a skull that looks like this, way down deep in the rock layers. He looks kind of vicious, doesn't he? Do you think he ate meat, or do you think when God created him, he ate like just leaves and vegetables and plants and stuff? Think he ate meat? You know what? Always go back to what God told us. After he finished making all the animals and all the people and the land animals, he said he gave, well, let me just, I'm not going to find it. Basically, he gave the plants for everything to eat. Do you know there's an animal called a panda bear? It has teeth way bigger and more vicious than this. It doesn't eat meat. It only eats bamboo. It uses its teeth to eat plants. It's only after death came into creation, after the fall, after mankind sinned, that animals started to eat meat. Before that, there was no death. Everything was perfect. It was a perfect creation. So just because we see an animal with teeth in the rocks doesn't mean it ate meat. We just assume it did. So here's our animal that I found. He looks kind of vicious. He's got a real flat forehead. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of cool. If I'm the first one to find a fossil, sometimes you get to name them after yourself. So I'm going to call this a Bruceosaurus, because my name is Bruce. So here's a Bruceosaurus. I found him. Now, suppose I'm digging in the rocks, and way down deep, I think it's really old, because I found him really deep in the rocks. I found this guy. And then higher up in the rock layers, I find one that looks like this. So they lived, I think, at a different time. If I leave the flood, they were all buried during Noah's flood, but I leave that out of my thinking. If I'm not training my brain to know God told me the truth, I might think those rocks took a long time to form. And if I found this one higher in the rocks, I might think, well, this guy, he must have turned into that guy over many, 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 many generations as he had babies and they had babies and they had babies. And eventually, look how he's a different size. He's kind of the same shape, isn't he? So I think he must be related, but he's a completely different size. Where did he come from? How could he have just appeared in the rocks? So I make up a story because I've been trained to think evolution is a fact. One animal changes into another. Lizards turn into birds. Maybe this big animal turned into a small animal. Well, how could that happen? Well, I just tell myself a story. I say, well, maybe there were lots of trees, and if this one had babies and the babies were smaller and they could hide behind the trees better, so they had an advantage. And after many, many generations, the little ones got married to the little ones, and eventually you have a new kind of animal that they're all little because they can hide better. And that's where it came from. So see, I've made up a story. I didn't see it happen, but I've made up a story to try to explain it. So now, and let me just put up the pictures. So that's the first skull, and there's the second skull. Now suppose I find this one, even higher up in the rocks. Now look at him. He has a bigger brain, doesn't he? It's more of a big sloped forehead, big brain. And he's also got a jaw that sticks way out. Okay, so he's a little different. He looks a lot similar to the other ones, but he's different. Where did he come from? I don't know, so I make up a story. Maybe because he has a bigger brain, he learned how to use his jaw and his teeth to stick out and dig underneath of rocks and dig underneath of trees and get little animals and bugs and eat them. And the more his jaw stuck out, the better he could dig. And he used his brain to figure out how to do that. And that's where he came from. He slowly just changed into another kind of animal. The story kind of makes sense. Maybe that's where he came from. So then, way up high in the rocks near the top, I find this guy. Now look how big his brain is. He's a little animal, but he has a huge brain, really big forehead. So he must be really, really smart, right? This is like Albert Einstein. He is so smart. But he's got to be smart because he's so small. To survive, he's got to have a big brain. So maybe that's where he came from. He got a big brain in order to survive, even though he had a small body. Now, see, I've made up stories to try to explain where all those skulls came from. How do I know whether I'm right or not? I don't. But if you train people to believe it's all true, they're going to believe it. Did any of that story involve God making those creatures? No, it pretended they all made themselves. Let me show you what they are. That first skull is a wolf. Okay, that's what a wolf skull looks like. The second one I showed you was a fox. Okay? The third one was a bulldog. Okay? And the last one, he wasn't Einstein. He was a stupid little chihuahua. Okay? Now, okay, this is something, remember how I said you don't all look alike? Your parents had children and each of the children looked different. You know, people in Africa look different than people in Europe. People in American Indians look different than people in China. Lots of different variations. All of these animals, the little chihuahua, the bulldog, the fox, they all came from the information God put into the wolf. There was no evolution. There was just a dividing out of different information. So none of them slowly turned one into another. All of the information needed in the book that creates the wolf was already there to make the fox, the bulldog, and the chihuahua. God made them all because he wanted to have lots of varieties of dogs. Did you know that a cat is so closely related to a lion that they can breed with each other? They're all a cat family. They're all one created kind. Cats and leopards and panthers and lynxes and lions and tigers, they're all one created kind of animal. And they can all be bred together. You can breed a lion and a tiger, and you can make a liger. Instead of a tiger, it's a liger. It's like a lion that has stripes like a tiger, because they can breed together. and all the way down to a cat, they can all breed together. Just like all these animals, they're all one created kind. So their skulls look very different, but it doesn't mean they weren't all created to be a common kind. When we see ape skulls and people skulls, there's lots of variation, but they're very, very different, and there's a big gap between them. So don't ever let anybody tell you that apes or monkeys turned into people, because it couldn't have happened. Okay, that's all I wanted to share this morning. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for paying so much attention. Okay, we do have time for some questions. Yeah, stand up. Nice and loud. She said, how can there be so many people after the flood? How can there be so many people on the earth after the flood? That's a good question. Noah had 3 sons and they had wives. So there was Noah and his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughter-in-laws. There were 8 people that came off the ark. Today, back when I grew up, today we look around and most parents, they only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 kids. When I grew up, a lot of people in my neighborhood, they had families and they had 12 kids or 10 kids. That was really, really common, okay? Before that, if you look and you Google it, how many children does a single mother has she had? There are hundreds of people listed that have had 20 children or more, just one mother. The record for a single woman in her lifetime had 64 children that we know of today. The people at the time of Noah lived for hundreds of years. So even the Bible, though the Bible only lists a few of the sons or daughters that people had, they had big families. So Noah's 3 kids, they probably had 20 or 30 or 50 kids over hundreds of years. Those children got married. They each had 20 or 30 or 50 kids. And then they got married and they each had 20 or more kids. Within 200 or 300 years, you would have millions of people on the planet. It doesn't take a long time to have lots of people if you have large families. So, okay, who's next? Yeah, go ahead. Yes? Yep, that's a good question. The bones had to have been buried during Noah's flood, and that was about 5,000 years ago. So those bones have been in the ground for 5,000 years. And the amount of tissue she found, she needed a microscope to see it. There wasn't very much left. Most of it's all gone. It's like our DNA is like a book filled with information. Most of that information had been ripped out and it was gone, but she found a little bit left. She shouldn't, if it had been there for millions of years, there should be no tissue left. There should be nothing soft. There should be no information and no DNA. So she just found a little bit, just a teeny little bit you could see under a microscope. But the fact there was anything there at all means those bones can't be millions of years old and that they were buried during Noah's flood. So no, there's no, as far as I know, and as far as anybody who's ever looked, there's no dinosaurs still left alive today. They died about 5,000 years ago. And even the ones that were brought on Noah's Ark, and I think they probably were, they were called dragons, but they're all dead. They're not around anymore. So, okay. The most common place for dinosaur fossils are rock layers that formed at a certain time during the flood. Probably the flood came and it buried sea creatures first. That's why they're down deepest. And then as the water rose, it started to hit areas around the coastal areas and swamps. And I think that's where dinosaurs lived. So they're all found in those same sort of rocks that formed at the same time. Those seem to be commonly in like Wyoming and Montana and Colorado. The Dinosaur National Monument is up in the north part of Colorado, fairly close to Utah. Utah, those are rock layers that seem to have a lot of dinosaur bones. Over in China, there's an area called the Gobi Desert, and they find lots of dinosaur bones over there in China in that area. Up in Russia, there's another spot where they find a lot. They find a few of them in Africa, but that's the main places. So, you want to catch a question over here too before we quit? But okay. Yep. That's a really good question. Once again, we always have to go back to what did God tell us, because he was the only one there that would be accurate and be able to tell us what had actually happened. He tells us Noah took everything that breathed air with their lungs, had the breath of life that lived on land. That would be mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians. Insects don't have lungs. Insects don't breathe air. So Noah would not have had to take any insects on the ark. And insects lay eggs. Those eggs would have floated around on the top of the water. They would have floated around on leaves and trees and vegetation that got ripped up. And as the water went down, those eggs would have hatched and the insects would have repopulated the earth. So some people who ridicule the idea of the ark, they say, the ark can't be true. There are a million different kinds of insects. You couldn't even fit them all on the ark. They don't understand. The Bible tells us they wouldn't have been on the ark. So Noah didn't have to take insects. He didn't have to take fish. He didn't have to take whales or seals or anything that lived in the water. Only had to take land animals. No insects. I kind of wish he had that mosquitoes hadn't survived. Would have been nice if they'd have died. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Can you tell me what he just said? His voice was too soft.
He wants to know why the fox skulls and
Yeah.
skulls look like dinosaur skulls.
Well, lots of things look similar. See, God is the great designer, and he took a design to make lots of different kinds of animals. So when he made foxes and lizard, or dogs, he made lots of kinds of dogs, and their skulls look quite a bit different. I mean, if you look at this, these are both different kinds of dogs. This is a wolf and this is a chihuahua, but they're both a kind of dog, but they look very different, but they're kind of similar. Well, if he's going to make a lizard has to have a skull. It's got to have kind of a long pointed head, so it's going to look somewhat similar to this, and God just used the same design to make a different kind of animal. A dinosaur is the same way. It's got to have a head. It's got to have a mouth if it's going to eat. It has to have teeth if it's going to chew. So it's going to have a similar design, but that doesn't mean a dog turned into a dinosaur or a lizard turned into a bird. It's just the same design by the same God to make a different creature. The little dog's called a chihuahua. I was pretending it was really smart because it has a big skull. For a little dog, it has a big brain. But it's no smarter or no dumber than any other dog. Just because of the size of your head doesn't mean you're smart, and it doesn't mean you're dumb. Some people that lived in caves way back at the Ice Age after Noah came out, they're called Neanderthals. Have anybody ever heard of a Neanderthal? Yeah, it's the name that people gave people who died like 4,000 years ago, and they lived in caves in Europe because there was an ice age and they were hiding in caves. Their brains were way bigger than ours. They were like 20% bigger brains than people today. And they were really smart, but it doesn't mean they were smarter than we are. They were just a little bit different than normal humans. Okay. Yeah, we could probably go on for hours. We need to make a decision how long to go. Yeah, who's been waiting patiently. I go to Fiji twice a year to talk to students like you guys. I speak to probably about 20,000 students in about 30 schools each time I go, and I stay for 2 to 3 weeks. So I go in March for 3 weeks, and then I go in like September for 3 weeks. And I speak in schools, but they only get to have 1 hour, and they each get one of the books that you're going to get next week. But now I'm also going to other countries. There's another island called Vanuatu with a bunch of people, and it's their own nation down by Australia. I'm going to another place called the Philippines, and each time I go, I'll stay for 2 to 3 weeks. So, and each day, we go to 2 schools in the morning, and then we go to 2 schools in the afternoon, and sometimes in the evening we teach the adults. So it's really, really busy whenever I go. Why does he have a big head? Because God made him that way. That's the only answer. God made him with a big brain. God wanted us to have little dogs, and he wanted us to have big dogs, and that dog is a little dog, and he just has a big head. Nobody has a better answer than that God made him that way.
Last question for this time.
Yeah. Yes, we found over a dozen examples. But remember, the entire DNA of a human being, it is 3 million letters long. So it's an enormous library filled with books. And each section of the library is called a chromosome. Each book is called a gene. You've heard of how our genes make the color of our eyes, or our genes determine how tall we are, whatever. The human beings have 20,000 genes. That's like a book filled with information. 20,000 different books. Well, the dinosaurs are the same. They probably have 1 billion letters, and they have tens of thousands of genes. But after something dies, those books start to fall apart. They start to disappear. So in 500 years, half of the books are going to be completely gone. They've disintegrated. In 1,000 years, 3/4 of the books are going to be gone. In 1,500 years, there's only going to be about 12% of the books left. In 2,000 years, there's only going to be about 6% of the books left. So when we find dinosaurs that still have soft tissue, and we can still find some DNA, it's only a teeny little percentage, like maybe 1 or 2% of the whole library. It's like 1 or 2 pages out of one book out of an entire library. So yes, we find some DNA, but it's not very much, and it's not enough that we could ever make a new dinosaur. Okay, that makes sense? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Everybody, we've run out of time. And I'd just like to end our session here by thanking you guys for your attention. And I do pray that this information will change your life for eternity. All truth of creation leads to the Creator. And if you accept the Creator, guess what? From there, eternal life.
Amen.